Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 10, Munnborg. Karth's manner was all business. If he suspected Rune of wavering, he gave no sign of it. It was their final meeting before the group would set out for Munnborg. The mission had been discussed previously, and Rune was a little curious concerning the object of this latest summoning.
We have received intelligence from our spies in Lysan.
Rune remembered Asar in his feathered hat.
Ah, the venerable merchant.
Karth continued.
The swarm's location has been uncovered. Princess Haldred survived the ambush that has taken the life of her husband. She got word out to Melvor, who passed it on to our man. Malik's overseer is orchestrating the affair in the West.
Rune slowly realized the significance of what he had been told. Julos was dead, and Haldred alive, trapped close to this mythical threat that was taking on more substance with every passing day. Yet he was distrustful now of any intelligence given him by Kale the Summoner.
You swear this is the truth?
Karth sighed.
Melvor believes it also. He has already sent word to Turik and Fengor.
Why Turik?
Tregoran has been deposed. The good Count reigns in Lygerium now.
He smiled wryly.
What a time to take over the defenses of that doomed place. He has won his kingdom only to lose it.
Rune looked at him strangely.
Melvor is still in Breck. Will he not be overrun?
Karth shrugged.
You know our good captain. He is fortifying the place, even if it is in vain. But our merchant has a plan.
What? Asar will stop the swarm?
Smirked Rune. There was another wry smile.
Not stop it, or even slow it down. Just survive it.
And Haldred? She will survive it too?
Karth frowned as he replied.
I know little of her situation at the moment. I believe she is still detained in the Waste. Perhaps the rogue there imagines a use for her after he has accomplished his task. Who knows?
He tilted his head.
You know her?
Rune was evasive. Haldred was no concern of the old man.
We have met on occasion. She's an exceptional person. Very exceptional.
Munnborg was an oversized trading post. Its harbor was well sheltered and deep, allowing merchantmen safe and swift passage during every season of the cycle. As a border town between Malik's extended realm and the Southland barbarians, it was well fortified with a strong garrison of marshlanders, infamous for their cruelty and corruptibility. The dockyards and sheds seemed dilapidated and filthy, despite the heavy traffic and masses of merchants passing through every day, or perhaps because of them, for no one cared to keep order in the mayhem of trading and petty crime perpetrated here at all hours. Harbor officials turned a blind eye and grew rich on bribes and payoffs, till they were discovered and replaced by others eager to do the same. Men flocked here to buy slaves, fen for the northern markets, fresh produce and spices carried from Jewel. Exotic items and animals from the southern jungles were also on offer, and ever popular with the Ligurian-bound vessels.
The men of Munnborg respected only one thing: force.
Families were organized as little more than criminal organizations, with the amassing of wealth by any means possible as their chief goal. They reigned over different sections of the city, from the multiple slums where there was little to generate wealth but the sale of bodies, to the seaside brothels and taverns where opportunities abounded. Often enough a minor war would break out among them, and much blood would be spilled before a truce could be enforced by the authorities. The city itself was governed by a Tour lord rarely seen, though his presence was felt everywhere. His tax collectors, backed by the steel of his crack guardsmen, were the most hated individuals in Munnborg, and had to keep constant vigil against assassinations by the more powerful crime syndicates. Most of the population, especially the poor, lived in houses constructed outside the walls, since the city had outgrown its defenses many cycles before. Raids from the savages in the jungle had ceased long before. The possibility of invasion by sea was not even considered. The garrison was employed to keep order more than anything else. During rhyme song, there was a marked decrease in traffic, it being their dry tide, and foodstuffs not as abundantly available as at other tides of the cycle. Men were more given to drunkenness now, and crime increased markedly as casual jobs in the harbor fell away. The docks of Munnborg could be a dangerous place for the uninitiated at all times, but especially as the darkening approached. Once again, Rune's party landed under cover of darkness. Cloaked and hooded, they made their way from the quayside over planking that reeked of fish and decay. Up a rotting stairway they tramped, onto a catwalk giving access to cheap rooms for seamen and casual travelers in which to spend the night. The idea was to rent a different room every second night or so, thus avoiding prolonged contact with any particular landlord. Onyx Man would seek them out during the day at a pre-arranged spot in the harbor. In spite of the late hour, there was still a considerable number of revelers making merry in the drinking holes of the dockyard. Drunken laughter, music, and shouting spilled into the night from half-open doorways and windows where the shutters had rotten away. Gareth looked about him with interest. The sprawling Southland city had a completely different feel to it than what he had encountered in Arran. The wooden structures were infused with the smells of ages and ages of miserable and lowly subsistence, of neglect and senseless violence. The walkways, dilapidated and dangerous, ran this way and that without any clear structure, spanning dark alleys and wide cobbled roads alike, to link all the upper stories in a maze of timber and rope. Tiny courtyards, mostly piled with refuse and old sacking, dotted the neighborhood. The sweetish odor of rotting produce hung in the air like a leaf-fall fog. Rune seemed to know his way about the place. He appeared confident. The primal threat of the casually violent and vulturine creatures who inhabited the area was somewhat dispelled by his presence and that of Tyro walking behind him. In fact, it seemed that the sickening veil of indifferent evil shrank back from him as they moved along, as if recognizing its master. But then, he had lived in towns like these for many cycles, and had dealt with creatures as vile and fierce as anything to which Munnborg gave shelter. Gareth watched him out of the corner of his eye. For the first time he felt an unknown apprehension about this man. Rune led them past the first few alehouses that straddled the very edge of the water. These were normally the most crowded places, where all manner of night stalkers plied their various trades. A partially honest man had little reason to enter such. Sailors disappeared without a trace during the dark hours, and merchants did not move about in the open without armed guards. Constant vigilance was required to keep body and soul together. Soon enough, Rune selected an inn with gaudy signs outside, proclaiming it the Dancing Pig Tavern with entertainment and lodging. Gareth wondered if the pig had anything to do with the entertainment promised. Judging by the smell, there could be something in it. The door on the upper level opened onto a dark staircase, down which they trudged tentatively, since some of the steps were missing. There was no one dancing downstairs, but plenty of fellows who could have passed for pigs. When they had reached the bottom, Rune told them to stay where they were. He marched up to the counter and addressed the heavy-set man behind it.
You have a room?
The bartender smiled broadly. He had small, bloodshot eyes, and the stench of stale fen wafted about his person.
That I have. Who is asking?
Greystone, from the Isles.
Rune pointed to his waiting companions.
And these are my shipmates.
The man produced a fragment of chalk, with which he proceeded to scribble on a badly scratched slate board.
How long?
Just a night.
He brought a hand to his chin as if this required careful consideration.
And what be your business in Munnborg?
A little ale trading.
Rune knew the local slang for illicit dealings. The man nodded as if something had been confirmed to him.
Which ship do you belong to?
The fellow was terribly nosy for a simple landlord. Rune decided to cut him short.
The one leaving tomorrow. Do you have a room or not?
He slammed down the coins on the counter to prevent any bargaining. He would not be taken for a fool who did not know the local prices and could be taken in for a few extra coppers. The landlord raised his brows.
Oh, no. That will not do, sir. There are 4 of you.
He peered curiously at the others as if trying to make out their features under the hoods.
That is the price for a single room.
Rune glowered at him.
Since when?
Oh, for a while now. Munnborg is the place to do one's business these days, is it not?
He smiled broadly, displaying the stained teeth of an ardent friend-lover.
You get 2 adjoining rooms for 12 coppers. That is the lowest price around the docks about now.
Rune handed over the money without argument. He did not have the stomach to stand here and argue with an old crow like this in the stinking sewage hole he called an inn. Besides, the coins were Garth's. The rooms next to theirs appeared to be unoccupied. If Munnborg was in such demand, the dancing pig did not seem to share in the good times. Shapes rather than numbers had been used to identify the different rooms, and these corresponded roughly with small wooden blocks of similar shape on the key rings. Rune smiled to think what type of seamen and wayfarers normally slept here. He tossed one of the keys to Tyro and wished the big Viran and Mullen a good night. Steering Gareth by the shoulder, he made his way to the room next to theirs. It did not seem strange that he had taken over the role of so-called bodyguard Garth had assigned to Tyro. Though useful in a fight, the man lacked vigilance. Had he not allowed the boy to fall behind when they had been pursued by the Ra in Fenvale? Rune could not ignore such incompetence. He was not one to stand by when others bungled their duties. It was a natural thing. The bent key provided by their host turned out to be unnecessary. The lock of their room had been forced long before, and nobody had bothered to repair it. Rather than go back down to complain about it, they merely moved the bed in front of the door as they would have done anyway. No lock could keep out a determined thief. The beds were surprisingly clean and sturdy. Somewhere in the establishment there had to be an efficient worker. Probably forced labor brought from a foreign land, Rune thought as he removed his cloak and boots. The blade he placed within easy reach. In Munnborg one slept with one eye open. He told the boy to turn out the lamp when he had changed into his nightshirt, and turned his back. As was the pattern now, he did not invite any conversation. He had enough unpleasantness on his mind already. Rune struggled to fall asleep. So many things about Munnborg reminded him of his old life. This was the place he had planned to settle in when Karth's men had fished him out of the cauldron. That was almost 8 seasons before. Next to him, Gareth was breathing deeply. Fengor's son, sleeping here in the same room. How had he been manipulated into this situation? What did he have to show for all this time of crawling about for the old man? Was he any nearer his goal? Who could tell? He still only had the word of the enigmatic lord of Heron Inrath, formerly Kale the Summoner, and his employer had conveniently neglected to mention that fact. How did one trust the person who played such games? Rune sat up, wide awake. Karth and his scheming be damned. There was no truth in his offer of vengeance, never had been. Even the excitement of adventure had grown stale. It was time to part company. He struggled with the pillow. Feathers were coming out the side, spilling onto the floor. Soon he would be left with an empty case. He folded what was left of it into a bundle and propped it against the headboard. Casting an envious eye over to Gareth's sleeping form and the apparently intact unit his head rested on, he settled down once more. What was he to do? Where would he belong? He should head east. Get out of it all. Let Kale and Fengor and Turik face their nemesis in Malik. What was it to him? Julos was dead. He would not be blamed by the relieved widow now. It would not be so difficult to wait for the storm to pass and pick her up in its wake. How he needed a female companion, and this was such an exceptional one. He sighed and turned over. It was all foolish speculation. He could not find peace anywhere without having settled his score with Fengor. All else would have to wait. Tyro had a task of his own to perform. The Southland captain, Karog, was believed to be in Munnborg. Karth suspected him of being the one selected to lead the Gudrid Empire's attack on Heron Inrath. He had to be located and followed till he departed for Goramul, at which time a message was to be sent to the spies there. Contact could be made via a certain coastal trader who traveled into Munnborg on a daily basis to sell produce in the market. On this first day of their stay, it was debated whether Millen or Gareth would accompany him. Rune decided that it was less risky for all concerned if the boy waited in the docks with him. He would be too conspicuous and had little experience. Millen walked off with Tyro, looking strangely relieved. Having agreed to stay in the pig for another night, they had left their bags in the care of the landlord. None of them carried anything of value. Their weapons and money they kept on their persons. Rune and Gareth strolled about the docks during the morning watch. Hunnick's man would meet them here, ask a particular question, and expect a particular answer. He had a written report for them to send to Karth. Meanwhile, Rune had to look around the city for signs of a military buildup. Malik might launch a surprise attack from this region, or keep forces here as a reserve. It was a location that could not be ignored. The time dragged by. Neither of them had much to say to each other. It was dull work poking about among the riffraff of the slummy town, waiting for someone they did not expect for another 2 days at least. Gareth could sense the distrust and antagonism in the man next to him, and it made him even more apprehensive than he already was. A growing sense of impending disaster had taken hold of him, multiplying since their arrival in Munnborg. He attributed this unease to the fact that the Darkening was fast approaching, and with it the time for the unleashing of Malik's swarm. Yet a feeling remained that the real cause was deeper still. He caught himself avoiding eye contact with Rune and starting guiltily every time he was addressed. There were several ships lying at anchor in the port, all merchantmen, presumably with Munnborg as their home, for none were being prepared to put out to sea. They seemed deserted, in fact, with lone watchmen pacing the decks or dozing in the rime-song sun. Rune looked them over with care. For the most part, they were in good repair and had certainly been in use recently.
Mid-morning, another ship eased into port under a light westerly breeze.
Its progress was lethargic. The men worked without the usual urgency and excitement one would expect when a fully laden trader came to land. Once it had moored, there was little activity apart from the sailors bringing their chests and bags ashore. 4 or 5 measly barrels were rolled over the gangplank from the hold. The ship was firmly lashed to the quayside, and a bow anchor dropped. No merchants appeared to barter for the transport or sale of their goods. Perhaps the captain had restrictions in what he was allowed to purchase, but Rune had the impression that no one expected the ship to set sail again any time soon. It was to join the others in their enforced inactivity. It was odd behavior, especially since the small coastal traders still moved about as always, traveling 1 or 2 days down the Southland coast with their usual cargo. The long-range trips to Ligurium, Nuria, and the Isles, however, seemed to have been suspended. Had the marshland traders been warned or instructed concerning the so-called swarm? Were they reluctant to set out for markets that might not be there when they arrived? The afternoon passed in uneventful idleness. Gareth watched the ragged children playing round the dockyards. He thought them carefree and fortunate, until he picked up the smaller details of their squalid existence, the scratching for lice, the gaunt, emaciated cheeks, the furtive eyes always on the lookout for gangs of bigger boys who would force them into petty thievery or hurt them just for fun. There was no one to protect them, no one to care for them in a proper manner. Munnborg was just another dismal place, where the strong oppressed the weak for sport and paltry gain. Rune returned to the pig without waiting for the others. He sauntered in to fetch his pack and pay the keeper for another night's lodging. As the barkeep handed him his belongings, he slipped Rune a note addressed to Captain Greystone and party. It was an invitation to dinner, signed by the owner of an establishment close to the Temple of the Destroyer in central Munnborg. Her name was Galia, written in a flowery, elaborate style. Rune smiled to himself when he noticed the perfume sprinkled round the script. Gareth saw the curling of his lips, and a sudden sick sensation washed over him. Here was the source of his recent unease. His skin prickled, and the air seemed to press down on him as if a terrific storm was about to be unleashed over the inn. There was a woman laughing, and a signpost swaying in the evening breeze. Rune pulled him to one side.
What's wrong with you? Do you feel sick?
Gareth swallowed hard and gave him an odd stare.
I will not go.
Will not go where?
To that swan place.
What swan place?
The boy pointed to the perfumed scrap of paper in Rune's hand. The man shoved it into his pocket. He was growing uneasy.
There is nothing about swans on there.
It's what she calls her place.
Memories and suspicions came back to Rune. The quick fire on wet logs in Fenvale, the odd pressure on his mind in Karth's training yard, the boy's composition of his blade.
I will not go.
Gareth repeated.
You will. You can't stay here. It is too dangerous. You need my protection. And since I'm going, you will have to come along.
The boy shook his head.
Tyro.
Rune did not wait for him to finish.
Is also going. Besides, I have little faith in him.
Gareth would not be silenced.
Oh, you think it will not be dangerous there? Is it a good thing that we show our faces all over town?
Leave the thinking to me, Pup. You were not brought along for your brains.
Frustration made the boy obstinate, though he knew the battle was lost.
Why was I brought along? I have no reason to be here.
Rune stared at him for a moment. Perhaps Karth kept his intentions hidden from the child as well. That was interesting. He shrugged and said,
The old man wanted you here. Don't ask me why. I thought you had access to his secrets.
Tyro and Millen had no objections to visiting a different inn at all. There was a question about how the lady knew of their existence, but they did not belabor the point. All things considered, the fare could only be better than what they had experienced thus far. The servant arrived, asking for them at the counter. A skinny little man, nondescript and overly polite, he could not be considered belonging to a household of disrepute or a nest of thugs. Only to Gareth did his manner appear false and insidious. All the way into the heart of the city, he kept away from the lackey as far as he could, without falling behind. If the housing here was different to that in the docks, it was only that there were fewer catwalks and generally larger structures. The same odors and decay were apparent everywhere. Only once they were in the close vicinity of the Destroyer's temple did the quality improve. There was a measure of wealth here and power. Large lanterns on lofty poles lit the way for them over cobbled streets. Stone buildings appeared among the wooden, and the voices ringing out from tavern windows were not always coarse or shouting obscenities into the night. The little man halted at last in front of a two-storied building, a friendly smile playing on his pointed face. Above his head a painted sign hung on two lengths of chain, moving to and fro in the strong evening breeze. On it was depicted a large bird in flight, and underneath the figure were the words, "The Silver Swan." Rune looked around for Gareth, frowning. He touched the blade at his side. The boy's strange ability to glean knowledge by merely glancing at a note had made him apprehensive also. If there were any trickery here, it would be regretted. They were led through the common room of the inn to a separate chamber where their hostess awaited them. Galia was a beautiful woman. The craft of her household had made her even more striking, enhancing the deep green of her eyes with subtle strokes and setting off the abundance of her dark hair with delicate strings of pearls. Lamps burning low exuded a pleasant but not overpowering perfume. It seemed a haven after the buffeting of ill odors outside. She rose to her feet as they entered, and signed to the little man to take their cloaks. Tyro took in his breath audibly at the sight of her, causing a flicker of a smile to appear on her visage. She was well aware of the effect her appearance had on men, and certainly knew how to use it to advantage. The dress she wore was soft and flowing, a silken sky blue, low-cut and sleeveless, so daring that if it were not for her obvious standing and class, one might mistake her for a simple harlot. Rune knew better. The set of her mouth, the look in her eyes, the way she moved and addressed the servants. Galia was used to being obeyed and demanding a certain respect from her lessers. She held out a hand to him as a queen might have done. Now that he was close to her, he could smell the same perfume as had been sprinkled on her note. There it had merely been a hint. Now it was seductive and a little heavy, as if the measure of it would be enough to beguile the senses. Her voice was as velvety and low as the soft light of her perfumed lamp.
Welcome, Captain Greystone, and welcome to your companions.
She looked at the others as Rune touched her outstretched fingers and inclined his head. Apparently she was versed in the peculiarities of Neurians, for she gave no sign of being offended at this.
I am delighted that you have accepted my invitation so promptly.
Again there was a flicker of a smile.
I shall do my utmost to be worthy of the trust you've put in me.
Rune frowned. Trust? She turned back to him.
Yes, dear Captain. In Munnborg it may be imprudent to accept invitations from strangers. It is not considered the safest city on the shores of the inland sea.
Rune's face relaxed into a smile.
I have traveled and lodged in towns of worse reputation. In all these I have not failed to honor the request of a beautiful lady.
Flatterer.
She clapped her hands excitedly.
Ah, but that is exactly why I would have you dine with me, sir. The price of your meal this night is a tale or two of your many adventures. How such anecdotes liven up my dull existence you could never fully appreciate.
She swept her arm dramatically across the room.
Please, Make yourselves comfortable.
2 servants stood ready to seat the guests at a heavy dark wood table in high-backed chairs of matching hue. The bowls, spoons, and knives were fit for a king's table. Galia was a woman of substantial means, and was not afraid to show it. In a city such as Munnborg, that meant that she was either exceptionally trusting or exceedingly powerful. Rune decided that it had to be the latter. As soon as they were seated, another servant appeared to serve them soup. It was rich and delicious, a true foretaste of the excellent meal to follow. As soon as the bowls were cleared away, Galia leaned in to her right where Rune was seated. The casual comment was certainly an attempt at making light conversation.
You are in the employment of a lord, no doubt.
Having expected such a question, he was ready with an answer.
It may surprise you, but I am the master of my own ship. I operate out of the Isles, under the protection of Rasgent of Kilvest, where I have a good berth when the weather turns bad.
You do not owe him allegiance?
He shook his head.
I owe no one allegiance.
2 servants entered, carrying large trenchers, and proceeded to place them in front of the guests. Galia looked at him directly. Her tone was lower than before.
Such a strong man, with nothing to fight for.
He regarded her for a moment in silence before replying.
What would make you surmise that I'm a strong man?
She shrugged and pursed her painted lips.
You carry a Nurian blade. That proves you are one used to settling disputes quickly and forcefully. Men who do not intend using their weapons carry old rusty swords or jeweled toys.
Rune found himself smiling.
You have a discerning eye, Lady Galia.
Gareth stared at the large plate in front of him. In the center was a small game bird, perhaps a young quail, crisp and brown, surrounded by small wooden skewers of meat, roasted vegetables, and a variety of strange-looking herbs. He touched it carefully, waiting for a warning. It seemed in order. The servant approached with a pitcher of wine and leaned over the table, preparing to pour some of it into a goblet at his elbow. Quickly, Gareth placed a hand over it. The man paused, looking helplessly at his mistress. Galia turned away from Rune to see what was causing the delay. Her eyes had fixed on Gareth. She spoke loudly enough for all to hear, but did not address him directly.
The little one seems uncomfortable about something.
Rune replied without looking up.
He is suffering from indigestion. Pay him no attention.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Her tone was as false as her smile.
Is there anything I can get for you?
Gareth returned her smile.
I am fine, thank you. I do not drink wine.
She raised her eyebrows.
A sailor who does not drink? How quaint. What would you have instead? Goat's milk?
Gareth colored a little.
Just water, thank you.
The servant nodded and turned to go. Galia looked him over closely.
Are you not a little young to be adventuring about the high seas?
Her interest seemed real enough, though he knew it was for reasons different than affability. Even so, he was almost taken in by it.
I am older than I look.
He was about to tell her about boys younger than him who crewed the boats in Arran when Rune interrupted.
You own this delightful inn?
He had the goblet of wine in his hand. Galia looked at him as if he had paid her a compliment.
This one and 3 more.
She spoke proudly, as if her ownership was a great achievement. Rune raised his goblet. He had taken care to notice that the servant who had filled his had also filled that of his host.
To hospitality and prosperity.
Galia laughed and raised her cup also. Rune was not sure whether she noticed or not, but he hesitated just long enough to make sure that she was actually going to drink the contents. The silly boy and his oddities had made him nervous. The meal was as exceptional as he had expected it would be when he had held the invitation that afternoon. He knew something about these remote wildland towns and the amazing diversity of their inhabitants. It would not be the first time he had experienced such a delightful diversion in such a dismal place. Once they had eaten their fill and more, the party settled round the fire on soft cushions and low stools. Rune waited till he had their undivided attention. He had a vast store of tales, amassed during his many cycles on the ocean, visiting the ports around the inland sea, or holed up during a storm in some forsaken tavern. Whether half of them were true or not, he did not know or care. They made excellent fireside telling. Even his three companions listened with rapt interest. Of course, they suspected that Captain Greystone had never undertaken such adventures as were related here this night, but the possibility existed that Captain Rune had, and if he had not, the fascination that came with the wild stories had taken hold of them also. When at last he declared an end to the yarning, Halia insisted that the group exchange their present lodgings with rooms in the Silver Swan. Rune protested that they had only modest means, and were but rough seamen who were better suited to the plain comforts of the Dancing Pig. She laughed loudly, and assured him their company, and the diversion of hearing about his adventures at her hearthside, would more than make up the difference in rates between her establishment and the other. He would not be charged a copper over what he was presently paying. No one could refuse such an offer. Tyro and Millen needed no convincing. The food had more than persuaded them. Gareth alone kept his opinion to himself. Rune ignored his frown and accepted. The servant was dispatched to the Dancing Pig to fetch their belongings. The rooms in the Silver Swan did not merely branch off a simple corridor or passageway. A charming little indoor courtyard, closed off from the tavern and dining halls by a strong gate, gave access to the lodgings. A night watchman was on duty here, nodding to them as they entered. Stout wooden doors carried polished copper numbers tacked onto them. Small gardens, hugging the outer wall, interposed themselves between. A pleasant odor filled the space, even though the tiny flowers were half-closed. Tyro smiled at the others.
This is more to my taste.
He pointed at the tiny flower beds.
Verdal blooms. They love shady places.
He touched Gareth's arm.
They are all over the southern forests, purple in color, and just smell that aroma.
He sniffed loudly. The boy looked at him in amazement. He would never have guessed the big, tough Viron to be in love with a little flower. To him the unfamiliar bloom was a potent if odd confirmation of the suspicion he still had concerning their hostess. Once he was alone with Rune in their room, and the door had closed behind them. He stared at the heavy iron hinges and said dramatically,
Now we are in her prison.
Rune snorted in disgust.
Your imagination is running away with you.
Gareth placed his pack near the bed furthest from the door.
Don't you think it's strange that she's so generous towards us?
No. She's bored, and in dire need of a diversion. I've seen this before. If the rich are secure in their wealth, they start spending it for the illusion of adventure.
And so you are going to clown for her in order to sleep in a softer bed.
Rune looked at him sharply, irritated by the boy's impertinence.
You prefer staying in that dockside hovel?
I hated it. But perhaps it was better than staying here.
For a moment, Rune considered throwing one of his boots at the child.
You are impossible.
They completed their undressing in silence. As Rune pulled back the bedclothes, the boy spoke up again to his annoyance.
So, you are not going to move the bed in front of the door this time?
The locks actually work here.
And they won't have another key for this room?
I will leave the key in the lock, Lord Suspicious, so they can't insert it.
Gareth stretched out on the bed with his hands behind his head. It certainly was far more comfortable than the bed in the pig had been. He watched as Rune turned out the lamp. Lauren's pale light fell through the shutters to make a pattern on the floor between them. Gareth's thoughts wandered back to the evening's proceedings.
So, I suffer from indigestion.
I did not want her paying attention to you. You might say something to compromise me.
And you are still operating your own ship from the Isles.
Rune raised up on an elbow.
Are you getting smart with me?
The boy was smiling to himself.
You are an amazing liar.
Speak for yourself.
Gareth sighed. How he hated the world, the insurmountable distrust, the situation he was in.
Only thing is, I get found out so quickly.
There was no response from the man. He turned his back and made himself comfortable. Gareth woke to the singing of birds outside their window. At first he was astonished that there could be birds in such a vile place as Munnborg. Then he marveled that they did not choke in the foul air. His chuckling woke Rune.
Had a good dream?
Yes, we were back in Fur, where it's not so difficult to breathe.
They got up, and Gareth looked about for his pack to get a change of shirt and undergarments.
Do you suppose there's a place to wash here, or should we rather try to fit in?
Rune glanced at him, half amused. So the boy was still a little prince after all.
Things around here might be a bit different to what you are used to, your highness.
Gareth sat on his bed, open-mouthed.
Evrain had a washroom in his house, and so did Lur.
Rune shrugged.
Well, there may be one here too. Galia is a lady of quality.
She is a witch.
Ready to renew hostilities, Gareth spoke his thoughts.
Your mother was a witch.
The boy shrugged in annoyance.
Don't trust her. She means you harm.
Trust? It was not a matter of trust, Rune thought to himself. He would simply amuse himself with her while he had the opportunity. There was much more to this one than commonly found in Munnborg, even among the upper classes. The boy kept at it.
Just because she looks better than the trollops in the harbor doesn't mean she's a noble person.
Thank you for dispensing such boundless wisdom.
Rune smiled suddenly.
So, you also think she is beautiful?
Gareth turned away his sullen face.
My mother was beautiful.
The man's sarcasm had hurt him unexpectedly. Rune stared down at the boy. Here was the stirring again of dark feelings best left alone. It served him right for unwittingly mentioning Aethera. Still, it was not fair that this child should have the right to torture him in return, even if it was unintentional. His next comment was not meant to be kind.
How would you know she was beautiful? I thought you said you saw her only once.
An accusing gaze fixed itself on the man.
I saw her twice. She spoke to me only once.
Twice. In all the time you lived in the king's house.
Rune was taken aback. Gareth searched his face for the sarcasm of earlier. It was no longer there.
Yes. She spent all her time hidden away, searching.
Realization struck him.
Searching for you. She destroyed herself with the art, and they made her take the poison for it. And I know that she suffered. But in the end she was glad to be rid of the prison they'd put her in.
There was a deep silence. Rune's voice was hoarse.
You mean Talon and the king?
The boy nodded.
The king knew, but he would not protect her. I think it was because she would not give up her love for...
There were tears now. He brushed them away impatiently. All his resolve was crumbling away.
I do not want to hate him. I do not want to hate you.
Me?
Unexpected anger rose in him. The sight of the boy's tears was strangely upsetting.
I was betrayed. She lied. She buried me. And your filthy father escaped with the blood of my brother on his hands.
Rune shook with sudden rage.
You do not want to hate him. How noble. But I hate him. And I hate her. And you are their son. And you carry her features and their gestures. And you look at me with her eyes.
There was a knock at the door, causing both to start. A servant had brought heated water for washing. Rune would have looked at the boy in triumph over this, but the air was still heavy with scathing words. Instead, he hurried the servant out, and after a little hesitation, poured the water himself. There was no sign of the lady of the house. She was absent during the morning meal and did not send a message or make a request via one of her servants. It seemed she was playing the role of a discreet hostess. They departed for their different destinations, Rune and Gareth in somber mood. There was little wind this early, and the air around the dock seemed particularly vile, especially after their sojourn in a better environment. They felt ill-prepared for the dreary day lying ahead. The words they had spoken that morning could not be unsaid. Both had revealed more than they wanted to. No measure of politeness could gloss over the stark honesty that had been forced from them. If the gap had been wide before, it seemed unbreachable now. By that afternoon, Rune had decided that it would be better to have Millen with him. He could no longer stand the awkward silence. If it was not for the boy, their time in Munnborg could have been enjoyable. Now he had to sit with these tortured thoughts and the constant welling of unreasonable anger. It was impossible even to have a cup of wine without feeling the silent reproach from the small form across the table. He had had more than enough of it. The afternoon wore on in uncomfortable silence. Once he caught the boy staring at him. Annoyance flooded over him.
Why are you forever looking at me?
Where am I supposed to look?
Don't get clever with me. Look at the damn floor. Look anywhere you please. Just don't look at me.
Gareth quickly brought up a hand to shield his eyes, leaving Rune feeling silly.
As long as you know I'm not trying to be disrespectful.
Oh, for the sake of all the plague-ridden gods of the pit. Why am I stuck with you?
He clenched his teeth.
Did that old man not consider that it would be impossible for us? Here I am, betrayed by your mother, and sworn to destroy your father. Do you know what it is to me to sit at table with something that belongs to him?
I am not Fingour's man.
Gareth had removed his hand. The blue eyes stared at the man fixedly.
Yet you would forgive him everything. All that he has done to you and to your mother.
It is not that I would forgive him, but it hurts me to hate him. I do not want it, that feeling. I do not want to know him anymore, what he desires. I want him to be nothing to me. But I want to know you.
The eyes were pleading now, pleading for trust and understanding, pleading for the impossible.
Why can't I be my own man, like you are? There's nothing of him in me.
Rune sat silently for a while. It was true that a part of him felt very sorry for the child. He had not asked to be confronted in this way, but all his sympathy could not alter the truth. If all could be swept away by a simple decision, then all his life in exile was without purpose. Then his love had never been pure and absolute, to fall in a compromise as soon as it was offered. The past could not be undone. It was time for them to return to the inn, and they rose to go. Still an answer had to be given. Rune knew in his heart that it would be the final word. He spoke softly, not allowing the show of anger of earlier to leave any possibility that the words were not meant.
I cannot believe what you are saying. I cannot believe it. Even if you have fallen out with Fingour, you are part of them.
What else was he to say? Here the proof of his unbearable loss stood in front of him. Aethera's son, who should have been his son also. She was dead and gone, even if he had wanted another chance. She had belonged to another man, even if her memory had been ripped from him. There was no argument, no denial of the harsh truth.
I am not a bad man, Gareth, but I can be, and I have been. It is best for you to stay away from me as far as you can.
The boy did not look up, nor did he reply. When he turned to follow Rune out, his shoulders sagged in sad resignation. 2 days passed uneventfully. Evenings were spent in Galia's company, and were pleasant enough for all concerned, except Gareth, who pleaded fatigue, and did not linger with the others at the fireside. He knew well enough by now that his presence was offensive to Rune. When the latter entered their room at night, the boy pretended to be asleep. On the first day they were together, Tyro cornered him about the change in his manner. The Viran knew it had something to do with Rune, and asked questions in that direction, to which he merely replied that they did not get along. The man gave him an understanding look that almost brought the tears out of him. In a way, it was a relief to be away from the docks during the day. Tyro left the city altogether in order to meet with a spy in private. Valek's captain had departed the city the previous day, and there was no longer any need to follow him about. All that remained was to report the fact to the trader. They lingered at the water's edge on a deserted beach, some miles from the town. Gareth splashed about in the sea, thinking of Keel with such longing that it hurt. The man came along after the noon watch, and exchanged only a few words with Tyro. He glanced about furtively as he spoke, and shoved off in a hurry, leaving the two of them to make their casual way back to Munnborg. The next day they went out again, in case there would be a return message, but the trader never made an appearance. Tyro guessed he would not even go back to the harbor now that his mission was fulfilled. The stars were bright overhead by the time they reached their lodgings. Their companions were already sitting at the counter in strained silence, ale in hand. Gareth excused himself, but Tyro joined the other two, informing them of the day's uneventful passing. Before long, Rune got up a little unsteadily to go and relieve himself. Tyro's raised eyebrows was answered by a shrug from the other. As soon as the retreating figure was out of earshot, Millen reported to him that Rune was not himself at all. He was upset by the smallest trifle that almost killed a man he claimed had looked at him in a challenging manner earlier that day. Apart from frightening Millen, he was drawing far too much attention to himself. Customers in several dockside alehouses already knew him by sight. It was time for Hunnick's man to arrive so that they could go back to Heron Inrath. Rune realized that the breaking with Gareth had snapped the last cord still binding him to Karth's cause. It had been inevitable. He had decided to part company before, he thought. But just how much the encounter with the Thera's son had influenced him to the contrary surprised him. He did care for his nephew in a way. Had this been Karth's hope? Had he expected this to help persuade the wayward heart of the exile? It was over at last. He felt no more obligation to the man who had only intended to use him. It was a lie, Karth's contract, and he needed no more prompting to abandon his side of it. He would have to rely on himself, as he always had, to achieve his desire. A reckless abandon took possession of him. He was ready to take any risk required. It was liberating. Rune stood alone again, against the whole of Myrel. Millen noticed the man first. It was hardly surprising, since Rune had not looked about him since they had installed themselves at their usual table in the Raven's Rest that morning. The fellow looked every inch a sailor. His brawny bare arms were tattooed from wrist to shoulder, his shaved head covered with a colored cloth knotted behind. Yet there was something about his manner and the way he loitered about aimlessly that was suspicious to the youth. Once he had subtly warned his companion, Millen was not so sure anymore, but Rune confirmed it soon enough. They were being watched. If he cared more about their mission, he would have grabbed the fellow that evening and forced a confession and a name out of him. As things were, it was a source of mild amusement to guess at the identity of their shadow's employer. Of course, it could be someone sent by the governor to keep an eye on strangers and their doings as a matter of routine. It could be Galia's man, trying to discover what they were about, since her own efforts had borne so little fruit. It could also be the leader of a band of thugs, awaiting an opportunity to relieve travelers of their valuables. The longer Rune thought about it, the less important it seemed. Even when a stranger sidled up to him at the counter and spoke the long-awaited phrase that identified him as Hunnick's spy, he did not arrange to meet elsewhere in fear of giving their contact away. He merely spoke the password in return and kept the written message slipped to him out of sight. What the sailor man would make of it could not bother him. Millen was more careful when he entrusted the man with Karth's instructions. He waited till the spy departed, and followed him outside before handing it over. If Rune's caution had gone to the pit, there were those who still hoped to escape Munnborg with their skin. Galia seemed to sense that the time was fast approaching for their departure from the city. That evening at table, she hinted that it would be deploringly dull once her guests took their leave, for there were so few others about at this time to make lively conversation. Indeed, it seemed to be true, since the only patrons of the Silver Swan were folks of the town, paying an evening visit for a drink or a meal. There were hardly any travelers who had need of lodging. Everyone had more wine than customary that night. The tales around the fire were bloodier and darker than before, till even Galia no longer seemed eager for more. Rune remained there by himself long after the others had retired to bed. He ordered more wine from a passing servant, and sat staring into the fire till there was only the dull glowing of red coals left of it. He woke to the throbbing of an exceptionally severe ache in his temples. It had to be almost noon. The boy had gone. The bed next to his was empty and made. The shutters were still closed, but the brightness outside peeped through in places, causing him to narrow his eyes to slits. Almost immediately, his sluggish mind renewed the battle he had fought to escape the night before. Instead of dulling his memory, the wine seemed to have sharpened it. He sat up and pressed his fingers into his eye sockets. He felt oddly disembodied, as if he was not completely in control of his faculties. With what had the woman spiced the wine? Perhaps one was not meant to consume so much at a time. He pushed aside the covers and sat groggily on the edge of the bed. He had nothing to attend to this day. There was nowhere he had to go. He could stay in here alone to ward off the barrage of vexation. Rune glared at the bed with its neatly turned covers. When had the boy left? There were sounds of muffled voices from the next room. Was he in there discussing the drunken fool who had once more attempted to drown out all the clamor of his broken existence? So the little pup did not want to hate him. Did the silly child think it mattered to him whether he was hated by Fengor's son or not? He did not care, not while the whole of Nuria despised him and had cast him out as filth. Curse the whole diseased lot. A bitter smile twisted his features. Hate, that was the sort of thing with which he could cope. He should leave them here, Karth's disciples, and make his way to Nuria without delay. The rage against Fengor would consume him else. He had to be free of it. Let Tyro struggle for the cause of his master. Rune would amuse himself in Munnborg, and then depart for his fated appointment with the past. His pulse quickened at the thought of Fengor's blood on his blade. Too late the guards would rush in. He would not care to be taken by them. He would not care what they did with him after. The long thirst would be slaked at last. Rune stared at his shaking hands. Somewhere a warning pressed through the red fog in his mind. He was losing his reason, his control. The long cycles of violence, spiced by the unbearable thirst for retribution, had worn away his resolve to stay alive, to remain free of Nuria and his broken dreams. There and then, in the final days of the 13th cycle since his banishment, far from home in the alien city of Munnborg, Rune was overtaken at last, and finally overthrown. Nothing remained but the helpless hate, not the memory of his trampled pride, not the taste of fierce love and happiness. He gave himself to the fathomless rage, gnashing his teeth against his tears, till his breath came too fast, in gasps of moaning laughter, and he tore at the wooden bedposts with his fingernails like a beast. But he would not scream. If all the fiends in the pit were to split his frame with fang and claw, they would not hear the expression of his agony. On the other side of the closed door, his companions could almost sense the change. The gloom had settled over them, though they found no words to speak, and shared no more than anxious stares and frowns. Millen had brought fresh fruit and bread from the market. In silence he prepared the midday meal. The three of them ate it as if a sentence was hanging over them. Gareth picked at his food and finally pushed it away half-finished. He was terribly nervous, as if hovering on the brink of some dreadful event. Tyro was the first to speak their thoughts.
The message must go to Lord Karth.
Gareth bit his lip. He could break the seal and relate the contents of the letter to Karth with little trouble. Should he not make the attempt? But the old man's warning still rang in his ears. He could not risk speaking through his thoughts, not here, surrounded by enemies and spies, workers of dark magic who would notice the alien practice among them instantly. But Rune would not act. Something had to be done.
I think he is awake.
He caught Millen's eye. The same apprehension he felt was written there. Tyro shrugged.
You go talk to him. Perchance he'll listen. It's no use I try. He'll throw me out.
Gareth waited till his hand stopped trembling before he slowly opened the door. He was relieved to see Rune standing over a basin, washing. Apart from the heavy bed being moved out of its former place, nothing seemed disturbed. He closed the door behind him and stood idle till Rune had toweled his face. If only his voice would not betray his apprehension.
Lord Karth said to send word.
The man would not let him finish the sentence.
To the pit with Lord Karth.
Rune glared at him with bloodshot eyes. Gareth belonged to a world he had finally banished. He would not tolerate further intrusion. The boy was shaking his head infuriatingly, like a little elder admonishing the wayward prince.
You're not being
Gareth searched for an appropriate word, sensing the other's mood, but could not find one.
prudent.
Prudent.
Rune spat out the word.
There's nothing prudent in this game, whelp. If you want to be prudent, take the road east and keep running for a cycle or two.
Unreasonable anger consumed him. He'd had enough.
Now take your prudence and be gone.
He sat down on the bed again, lowering his face into his hands. Gareth tried a final time.
Only a 10-day remains before the darkening. There won't be another mission for us.
Rune did not let him finish. He leaped to his feet, causing the boy to step backwards. Thrusting his face close, he snarled out the words.
And won't I be happy to be rid of you?
There was no reply. The boy's eyes fell away. His expression became a mask. He turned away without as much as an acknowledgement. Outside in the courtyard, he pressed his back against the wall. The tiny purple flowers looked on passively from their little islands of dark soil. He slid down to sit on the paving next to them. Spite. Hurtful words brought pain and anger. Why did he need the approval of this despicable man? He was a little fool, falling into the trap Evrain's wife had fought to escape. Rune was a wounded animal. Every attempt to help him was interpreted as interference, causing more pain, more frustration, and anger was the only way to defend himself. Without it, he would lie down to die. Why had he been able to help Evrain? Why had the Aeronite listened and responded to his audacity? He had been an outsider in Kiel, an onlooker. Here it was different, he knew it. He was not only part of the problem, he was the problem. It had been a mistake, Karth's gamble, and now, on their final mission, the hopeful experiment had come apart at the seams. Tyro and Millen stayed out of Rune's way as far as they could. Both still hoped the terrible mood was a result of too much drinking, and would improve by the evening. Not surprisingly, therefore, Rune appeared cordial enough during their meal, but there was no opportunity to discuss the message and Karth's instructions regarding it, for their hostess was in constant attendance. When she showed no signs of retiring, they eventually excused themselves, hoping that Rune would follow suit. The two waited in the courtyard for a while before giving up and turning in. Rune kept drinking steadily as the night before. Galia spoke in low tones, sometimes evoking a response, but mostly by herself. She revealed little things about her life, her supposed loneliness, her struggle against the lack of refinement among the city folk in Munnborg. Eventually, she appeared to grow tired of the monologue and excused herself. Rune hardly noticed. Only once she had been absent for a while did he look up in surprise to find himself alone. The wine no longer tasted the way it should, and he dreaded the headache the morning would bring. Tyro and Millen dragged Gareth into their room as soon as they returned from breakfast the next morning. The three of them would work out a strategy to fulfill the mission and get all concerned out of Munnborg. That meant in reality that Tyro made suggestions and the other two were required to fall in with them. No one found that strange, since Millen and Gareth had no suggestions to make. The big man looked a bit ridiculous, speaking in such measured tones while trying to keep his voice low.
Millen should go back to the ship and take the report to Lord Karth.
He pointed at Gareth.
The two of us will stay with Prince Rune to persuade him to leave with us before the darkening.
Quickly, he worked out the detail of the plan. Millen would carry the dispatch directly to Karth's Isle, and return with the ship as swiftly as possible to pick up the others in Munnborg. Tyro would signal from the shore just before the third watch, and wait for an answer. A ship's boat would sneak into the port and carry them away. The big man sat back and rubbed his hands as if it were all settled already. He brought a finger up to his chin.
That leaves just one thing. Gareth must get the message for us.
The boy jumped to his feet, indignation written on his face.
Why must it always be me? You're two big fat cowards.
Call us what you like, but you know how it is. If one of us gets caught in there, we might get killed outright. You're different. You're kin of his, and he's not a blind killer. Besides, you are a child. He might just hurt you a little.
Gareth opened his mouth to argue, but he could see it was no use. He stalked off to the next room, mumbling to himself.
Hurt me just a little.
Rune lay on his back, snoring, dead to all of Myril. He kept the letter on his person, Gareth knew, in the inner pocket of his doublet. Fortunately, he had undressed before falling into bed the night before. His garments were scattered on the floor. It took but a moment to secure the document. Gareth froze as the sleeping figure stirred, but there would be no waking the man yet, not with a bucket of cold water. It was still sealed, if a little dog-eared. They looked at one another. Rune had not even bothered opening it. Something was seriously amiss with him. Tyro wondered for a moment whether it would not be wise to send Gareth back with Millen, but then he was certain the boy had the best chance of making Rune see reason. Rune merely nodded when Tyro informed him that Millen had taken ship for the Witch Isle. Since the expected storm did not break out, Tyro took heart again and decided to wait for an opportune moment to preach the subject of going home. They had several days before a ship could arrive from here in Inrath. He prepared himself to wait it out. Meanwhile, he would take the boy on walks around the town to get him out of the inn every day. Perhaps Rune's frayed nerves would get an opportunity to settle. At the fireside that evening, Galia broached the subject of leaving once more. After emphasizing how fond she had become of their company, she made a suggestion directly to Rune.
Stay a while, at least another 10 days. There are sights to see, even in a city like this, if you're looking at the right time. There is a great festival here during the Darkening, lasting for 5 days.
She smiled seductively.
One may lose oneself easily in the gaiety and sweet abandon of Lauren's laughter. Almost anything is permissible.
A hand casually draped itself on his arm. He left it there, pretending not to notice. It was tempting in the extreme, Rune thought, not only to take advantage of her obvious invitation, but to establish himself here in Munnborg. Selectively, he remembered Malik Yulian's welcome in Unmeric, and the trade agreement bartered there. If the Swampland Lord had wanted him dead, he would not have walked away then. Cale could not be certain of the man's intentions after all. In this city of forceful and underhanded trade, it would not be too difficult for an able man to establish himself, especially when he had a ruthless and powerful woman at his side. Was this not the place to survive the swarm and become part of the new order? But what of Fengor? He could never find rest here while the swine still lived and breathed somewhere. Galia's voice reached him from afar.
In Munnborg, one can make one's own laws after a fashion. It is a place for those who would not be hampered by senseless traditions and oppressive regulations. I believe not even Trax Isles can compare to it.
Rune looked at her closely. It was the first time she had hinted at having first-hand knowledge of the Isles. He suspected there was much more behind it.
You are familiar with the Isles?
One could say that. I spent time there as a child.
She steered away from the topic immediately.
But you are familiar with all the shores of the inland sea, are you not?
Rune was evasive.
I have seen most of them, I suppose.
Galia slowly dragged a finger over his sleeve.
And in all your adventures, you've not found a woman to steal your heart?
He looked at her sharply. Perhaps she was trying a little too hard. Perhaps her intentions were sincere. He paused for a moment before replying, as if he was giving the matter serious consideration.
In it all, I have never met a woman I would not swap for a cold drink of water on a hot day.
There was an odd check in his mind as he said it. Strong, repressed feeling gave his statement the lie. Aethera, of course, had been the exception. But there was something else, too. The scandalized eyes of a Ligurian woman, sitting close to him in the throbbing alehouse in Breg.
There is a first time for everything.
Galia smiled again, that languid, knowing smile of hers. She was a beautiful creature. He emptied his cup. The wine was going to his head. Tonight he did not feel such a need for oblivion as before. He rose to take his leave. She did likewise. For a moment she stood very close to him, her body inches away, the enticement of her perfume wafting over him, filling his senses. Was this the offer he had been expecting? Had she pretended long enough to keep a measure of her reputation intact? Tonight he could seal the contract, gain the ally that would ensure his future prosperity in the city. Neither made a move. Her gaze lingered on him like a caress, green and dark in the amber light of the fire. Oh, she was sure of herself. An unwelcome, nagging thought entered his mind. She is a witch. Blue eyes appeared over the green, accusing, entreating. He brought up a hand and pressed his forefinger and thumb onto the bridge of his nose. Suddenly, he longed for a drink of cold water. The moment was lost. Galia sat down again after Rune had said his good night and departed. A slow smile spread over her features. She was enjoying this game more than she had anticipated. This was the big fish of her dreams. She was almost certain of that. With such a catch, she was bound to regain the favor of her lord, the terrible Prince Rune. He did not seem like much now, hardly a threat, and no match for her wiles at all. He did half the work, with his heavy drinking and obvious discontent. She laughed loudly. Zebar had been right. He was such a fool for a pretty face. He would stay in Munnborg till the Darkening without further persuasion. There was no need to risk detaining him, at least not while the others were around. He was a most willing prisoner. She stretched out her legs and shook with pleasure. Why had the old fool sent him here, where he was almost certain to be discovered? Perhaps he wanted to be rid of him. Perhaps he had not turned out to be the hoped-for ally after all. The long wait was almost over. The time for reaping their long-overdue harvest had arrived. Glory and rich reward awaited those faithful who had labored so hard and so long. The tide of retribution could not be stopped. Then there was the little one. A frown creased her brow. Would he be worth capturing? Rune cared for the boy, that was beyond doubt, even if they were at odds at the moment. Was this enough to prove his identity? All her probing had been fruitless. The child kept to himself and had not let anything slip. Yes, he looked like the one Horan had shown her, but would one of such potential not have seemed a greater threat? If he was just an ordinary boy. No, there had been moments at the table where she had perceived the odd pressure, someone measuring, assessing, the hostile gaze of this child upon her when he thought she was occupied with something else. She would not delay any longer. Soon the boy and the big Viran would be taken. She would simply inform Rune that they had departed in the night for a destination they would not disclose. He expected them to, did he not? Gareth walked about in a state of utter despondency. The city and its squalor was depressing. The mission had become meaningless. There were no signs of change in Rune's dismal state of mind, and Heron Inrath seemed 1,000 miles away. Annick had told him that the island would definitely come under attack and would almost certainly be overrun. Another home would be lost to him, and he would not even have an opportunity of saying goodbye to it. Where would they go once the ship arrived? Was there another small island on which they could hide? How would the odds of the barbarian invasion and the massive swarm ever be overcome? What of the dragon and the futile attempt at finding a champion to combat it? Here they were trapped in a rotting city with a madman who did not even know what he wanted, and this madman was Rune. He could not even practice the art for fear of being discovered. Certainly Karth had no more use for him. That was why he had been sent here to wither away with his useless kinsmen. One dismal day ran into another. When Tyro finally mentioned leaving to Rune, the man smiled politely as at a stranger and told him to do what he wanted. With only 4 days to the Darkening, there was no more time to linger in Munnborg. Tyro instructed Gareth to pack his things and be ready to head out after midnight. At table that evening, Gareth struggled to eat anything. He kept stealing glances at Rune. Chances were that they would never meet again. He dared not let his thoughts dwell on the possibility. It was hard enough controlling his emotions as it was. He waited in their room after supper, with his clothes rolled up in his pack, hoping that there would by some miracle arise an opportunity to say farewell. But Rune's nightly visits continued as before. By the time Tyro knocked softly, the boy had scribbled a hasty note and was ready to depart. The streets around the temple were quiet. They moved along hurriedly, their breath steaming in the lamplight, their tread disturbingly loud on the cobbled street. Far above to the west, Pelia's blue train streaked across the sky. The Darkening was at hand. Noise rose in front of them as they approached the harbor. Gareth felt relieved that they would soon leave behind the harsh shouting and the constant threat of violence and brutality. It was sickening just to listen to it. Catwalks passed over him, bridges to nowhere. Here and there the houses creaked as people still moved about. At last they halted with the distant roar of the ocean in their ears. To Gareth it was the sound of freedom.
Wait here.
Tyro crept away, rounding a corner, down towards the docks, a lantern veiled in his hand. The boy sat down on the broken crate to wait. It would not take long. He fervently hoped Millen had not been delayed. The stink of the place had probably seeped into his skin by now. He covered his nose with a sleeve.
Rune.
The sadness crept up from the walkways and blind alleys. It coated the sagging roofs and railings in soft, briny perspiration. It settled on him and pushed into him till he was just one more trophy of its triumphant march. He sat staring at his feet till the tips of his boots became blurry and the breathing broke from his chest in gasps. If he went back to the Swan, what would be the use? He was not wanted. There was nothing he could do. Rune had lost his mind. He had slipped beyond the reach of any help. Nothing remained but for him to be taken or to die here, in this horrible place. To go back would only mean to share this fate. There were others. There was Evrain and Lur, Hunnick, Bjor, Karth. Oh, but this man had to be the one to command all his devotion. He could never push him away like Fengor, or look on again in helpless dread as he had been forced to do with his mother. This time there was no letter, no sad farewell, no regret, only the memory of a shared smile, and of the sharp pain as the strong fingers worked the Ra's poison from the gashes on his back. It could not be all. He would not be robbed again. What would be left of him after this? Where could he find a place where the sadness would not overtake him? He thought of Fenvale and the arrow, the scarred body trembling under his fingers, the helpless swearing. Would he leave a man to suffer like that and not keep trying to release him from pain? And this was not just any man. Tyro's heart was beating in his throat. His signal had been seen and answered. If another party had been watching the sea, there could be trouble for them now, unless they were quick about it. He rounded the corner where he had left Gareth and cursed under his breath. The boy was gone. Gareth hurried through the dark streets, keeping to the shadows. His thoughts were a jumble of recriminations and numb fright. What was he doing? Had he also lost his mind? He was throwing away his life, and for nothing. Would Tyro not come after him? What a fool he was! How would the poor man know what he intended to do? Would he not think the worst? He stopped running and looked back towards the harbor. Footsteps echoed in a side street, coming in his direction. Fear quickened his pulse. He had to get to the inn. There was no movement in front of the Silver Swan. He slipped through the gate, breathing heavily. Some of the sadness had already lifted. He had made the right decision. It was late. The common room and dining rooms were deserted. Rune had turned in earlier for a change. The door to their courtyard stood ajar. There was no sign of the night watchman. He remembered the note he had left behind. Perhaps Rune had not been in a state to notice it. There was a possibility of retrieving it before he did. Gareth pushed open the door and hurried into the yard, taking care to move as quietly as he could. On the edge of his vision something moved. Too late he saw the heavy, muscled arms reach for him. He struggled like a wild cat, but his arms were pinned to his sides, and the man was strong as a bull. He remembered to call out and drew breath to do it. Not 20 yards away was salvation. His lips formed the name he had wanted to call all his life. A hand closed over his mouth and nose, suffocating, powerful, viciously twisting his head to the side. Pain exploded through his neck and shoulders. Tears blinded him. He ceased struggling. There was another man now. Whispers. They were dragging him away. He could die with it. The anguish and the terror. The hooded man had found him at last. Rune made his way back to his room slowly and deliberately, like an old man. He ought to be more intoxicated than he felt, for he had drunk as heavily as before. Yet the warm, heavy ache of drunkenness only covered him like a cloak, instead of dulling his thoughts and becoming the opiate he craved. He smiled. So the talented Galia had finally made a mistake. It was glaring, really, in the light of her great care up till now. She had offered him a girl for the night. At once the pretense of love or even physical attraction had been shattered. He had not shown anything, but she doubtlessly had to have realized it. Now he was certain it was all a game. Gareth had been right after all. He pushed open the door to the courtyard. It was deserted. He frowned. The guard had never been absent before. The bedroom door was unlocked to let him in, the boy asleep inside it unprotected. He hurried forward and turned the knob. The door creaked open. A lamp was burning inside the room, casting its light over the empty beds. He swore and turned to check Tyro's room. With Millen gone, perhaps the boy had moved in there. It would be safer. The key was in the lock on the outside of the door. The room was dark and empty. So they had left after all. He was alone again. Was this not what he had wanted? It was better all round. Karth's disciples had returned to their master. Rune sighed heavily and returned to his room. The final link had been severed, and he had not been the one to do it. He shut the door and sat down on the bed. Suddenly it seemed too great an effort just to remove his clothes. He lay back on the pillow. Something crackled behind his back. He pulled out a torn page, folded in half, his name scribbled on the outside with charcoal. Rune sat up again abruptly, opening the paper in haste. It was a short note, only a few lines. The writing was childlike but legible.
We are leaving tonight. I hope to say goodbye. I do not know where we are going or if I will see you again. I hope we meet again. I am sorry that we could not be friends and that I caused you pain. There are people who care about you. I am one. I know that love is stronger than hate.
The boy had not signed his name. It was not necessary, of course, or perhaps there had simply not been time. There was a tug, a touch. For a moment he sensed her, the youthful girl in Gilrath's hills, but more still, a whisper in his mind of what could have been, of what was. He became intensely aware of her, the smell of her, the touch. He almost spoke her name aloud. Yet there was nothing but the room to see, nothing but the faint sounds of the sleeping inn to hear. He turned back to the pillow, the sour taste of wine still strong upon his tongue. Stronger, more urgently came the call. He was on his feet, his hands pressed to his ears.
What do you want?
He was almost surprised to find no slur in his speech.
Ethera!
Had he lost his mind? The traitorous woman was dead, far beyond his reach. Yet he had felt her shadowed attendance for cycles after he had last laid eyes on her. Times without count, during the long empty nights in Curtain, he had drowned depressing awareness in rivers of ale. Had it not been similar then? Had she slipped the chains of the afterlife to gaze upon him once more? Something was different, indefinably, curiously different. Karth? Rune moved till his back pressed against the stones of the wall. He lowered his arms slowly. No, it had not been the sorcerer of Heron Inrath probing his thoughts from afar. He shook his head slowly. Obviously, he had not imbibed enough for silent sleep. That could be easily remedied. And then it struck him, almost gently, like a shaft at the very extreme of its reach, with barely enough potency to break the skin. Still the venom of it reached into his chest, till the warm pain of loss congealed there. A terrible crime had been committed, and he had been the perpetrator.